Well, Dr. Jordan Peterson, welcome to Sydney on your Australian tour. You're talking to packed out houses and the interest is extraordinary. And we've had the opportunity to talk personally and I can understand why.
Well, there's two things about that I think are really worth laying out. The first is an analysis of the purpose of memory. Because people think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And that's the purpose of personal memory. And so you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, that's really obsessing you, if you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. So memory has a very pragmatic function. That's also not something that we've been good at communicating to young people. If we talk to them about responsibility, we generally do it in a finger-wagging sort of way. It's like, well, you're breaking the rules, you're a bad person. And well, that may be true because people break the rules and there's no shortage of badness in people. But the proper message for young people is to say, well, no, you don't understand. You want to take on responsibility. You want to take on the heaviest load that you can conceive of, that you might be able to move, because it gives your life nobility and purpose. And that offsets the tragedy. And not only psychologically, not only does it offset it psychologically because you have a purpose and something to wake up for, right, and to face the difficulties of the day, but also because if you face the difficulties of the day properly, you actually ameliorate suffering, not only in the psychological sense, but because you make the world at least a less terrible place. And that's something, right? To move things away from hell is something, even if you're not, self-evidently moving forthrightly to heaven. To move things away from the worst they can be is, well, that's a noble goal in and of itself. So, and young people are starving for that idea. It's very interesting to watch. I have a lot of respect for the atheists generally because they've generally thought a lot more about the situation and struggled with it more than the complacent fundamentalists, who wallpaper over their doubts with overstatements about their belief. The atheists, the word Isaac means, or Israel, the word Israel means he who struggles with God. It's like, well, it's not obvious that it's not the atheists, they're struggling away. It's like they're obsessed with it even. And so they have God more on their mind than the typical person who's a believer. And so it's interesting too because there's been this little community develop around my biblical lectures in particular of people who call themselves Christian atheists, which I think is quite remarkable. So if I lay out the rationale for the Christian ethic, which is something like pick up your damn cross and struggle uphill, which is a really good message, they think, oh yeah, well that makes a lot of sense. It's like, well, I don't need the metaphysical baggage. It's like, well, maybe you do and maybe you don't, but even to pick up the practical utility of that idea, which is overwhelming, that's an excellent start. First of all, you have to treat yourself like you matter, because if you don't, then you don't take care of yourself and you become vengeful and cruel, and you take it out on people around you, and you're not a positive force. None of that's good. So you suffer more and so does everyone around you. And there's a malevolence that enters into it. None of that's good. So that's what happens if you don't treat yourself like you matter. And then, well, what happens if you don't treat other people like they matter? Well, you lie to them, you cheat them, you steal, you enter into impulsive relationships with them. They can't trust you. That doesn't go anywhere. They don't like you. You end up alone at best and maybe like incarcerated at worst. Like that doesn't work. And so you watch the people around you who thrive, regardless of what they say. They act out the proposition that everyone matters. And then you have a functional society. And I think, okay, well, if when you act out the proposition that everyone matters, you have a functional society, maybe that's evidence that that proposition is true. It's like, I think it's true. I think the idea that the individual has a spark of divinity within him or her, I think there isn't a more true way of saying that. If you ask someone to sit for 5 minutes and think, okay, well, what mistakes have you made in your life? It's like, that'll come up pretty quickly. And you can even ask people, well, what terrible, unforgivable mistakes have you made in your life? It's like, yeah, well, we know about those too. It's like, it's no one's so naive, unless they've really wrestled intensely against themselves, There's virtually no one so naive to not be able to answer those questions. So we know that we've done things we shouldn't have done, and we know that we're not living up to our potential. Psychologists have been, not all psychologists obviously, but the psychological profession is neck deep in this pathology, has been beating the self-esteem drum for 50 years. Oh no, you're okay, you should feel good about yourself. Like, you're fine the way you are. It's like you think, well, that's a calming message for people. It's like, no, it's not. It's not at all. And I watch my audiences, it's like, it's full of people in the audience who think, I'm suffering a lot more than I think is tenable. A whole bunch of it's my fault. My life is not in the order it should be. I know I'm doing 50 things wrong. It's like, what the hell's wrong with me? What's wrong with the people around me? This is really serious. And some, well-meaning person comes up and says, you're okay just the way you are. It's like, no one wants that message. It's like, no, I'm not okay the way I am. I'm not okay at all the way I am. I know that. And so, when I'm speaking when I'm speaking now, I say to people, well, no, you're nowhere near what you could be. That's the positive message. It's like, yeah, you're a mess, but you don't have to stay that way. If you're a mess, you know it. Obviously, you're suffering away like so much you can barely tolerate it. It's like, that's okay. You could do something about it. And that's the thing that turns the lights on. It's like, you could do something about it. It's like, oh. Well, we're characterized by inertia and ignorance. It's not easy to understand history. It's especially not if you read it properly. I had a client at one point who was an unbelievably naive person. You cannot overestimate her naivety, no matter how hard you tried. Her parents taught her that adults were angels, literally. And she believed that in a strange sense. When I met her, she was in her 20s. And she had this extraordinarily naive view of people and had been hurt. And if you're very naive and you've been hurt by someone, you often disintegrate because it blows your world apart, and that's what had happened to her. And I said, she had a university degree, and I said, well, look, like in the liberal arts, I said, didn't you read any history? And she said, well, yeah. And I said, well, didn't that disturb the whole adults are angels hypothesis? And she said, well, I read it, but I just compartmentalized it. And that gave me the key to what was wrong with her, and we successfully dealt with it. But I had her to begin her process of cure, oddly enough, because she had to understand malevolence, because she had been touched by it, right? She had to understand it because her naive worldview had been shattered by the hand of malevolence. I had her read a book called Ordinary Men by Browning, and it's a study of these Polish policemen, German policemen who were sent to Poland after the Nazis had marched through Poland, and they were sent to police Poland, and they were, decent middle-class guys, essentially, most of whom had been hit maturity before Hitler had come to power, so they weren't indoctrinated Nazis, not like the Nazi youth types were, and they had to go to Poland and be policemen under wartime conditions. And they had a very humane commander, and he told all of them that they were going to have to do things that would be far more brutal in all likelihood than they were normally prepared to do in their role as non-military policemen, but that they could go back to their old job if they wanted to. So it wasn't top-down enforcement of an authoritarian ethos. And Browning documents their transformation from the guy next door, the policeman next door, into people who were taking naked pregnant women out into fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it's a brutal book because, well, these men, it's like, it just ruined them to do that to themselves. They were physically ill during the process of transformation, and he does a very good job of documenting how an ordinary person transforms into a Nazi murderer. And I had to read that. I said, but don't you compartmentalize it. This is about you, right? This isn't about someone else. When you read history, you think, well, that's about someone else. It's like, unless maybe you're a victim and you identify with the victims. It's a very rare person who reads history and identifies with the perpetrators. But unless you read history and identify with the perpetrators, then you don't understand history at all. And so who wants to understand that? And I get my students, I said, look, I've told them this for 30 years. Here's something you have to understand. If you were in Nazi Germany, the statistical probability is overwhelming that you would have been a perpetrator, right? You think you would have rescued Anne Frank. It's like, think again. Those people are very, 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 very rare. They put their lives on the line to do that. They put their families' lives on the line to do that. You think you're one of those people? Really? It's like that. All that means is that you know nothing. You know nothing about yourself. You know nothing about people. You know nothing about politics or economics or history. It's a harsh lesson. You think, well, if it's possible to be enlightened, why isn't everyone enlightened? It's like, well, you don't get to paradise. You don't get to heaven without harrowing hell first, right? And who's going to do that? Like, that's a terrible thing to do. It isn't even clear that you can survive it. No, I mean, it's brutally damaging to come to terms with your own proclivity for malevolence. And so people don't do it, and it's no wonder. But the funny thing is, and this is also something that I think that people who've been watching my lectures have been attracted by, especially the young men, it's like, until you understand that you're a monster, until perhaps you even develop that as a capacity, you don't have the moral force to do good. And so not only is that descent to begin with necessary to scare you straight, right, to make you understand what exactly it is that you're dealing with, but you don't even have the strength of character to be good until you understand just exactly what sort of monster you can be. I have a rule in my book, Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Yeah, I read it.
It's a meditation on the monstrousness of parents. It's like, don't underestimate yourself, your capability to ruin your children's lives. You let them act in a manner that makes you disapprove of them. You will take revenge on them in ways you cannot even imagine. And unless you understand that, you're not going to be careful enough as a parent, and you're not going to set proper boundaries. Don't let your children annoy you. It's a very bad idea. Now, you know, that means that you should try to regulate your proclivity to be annoyed, and you should try to be civilized, and you should talk to your partner, your wife, or your husband about your oversensitivities and foolishnesses. But having said that, you need to know who the monster is, and it's you. There's another rule in my book, which is Rule 9. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. Well, they do. The person you're listening to knows some things you don't. You can be sure of that. Now, whether or not you can get to them is a different matter, but if you do get to them, it's a real deal for you. That's why you want to listen to the other person's arguments, is because you're not everything you could be. You don't know the pathway forward with as much clarity as you could. And it's possible, this is one of the wonderful things that I've had the privilege of experiencing as a clinician. You know, because people, it's like I live inside a Dostoevsky novel as a clinician. People come in and they tell me about their lives, and I listen to them, and they tell me things that are just absolutely beyond belief, you know. And I learn from my clients constantly. They're telling me honestly about their experience. They tell me things they wouldn't tell anyone else because I actually listen to them. But part of the reason I listen is because I'm desperate to listen. It's like there's a possibility I'm going to do something stupid in the next 5 years that's going to be like fatal. And there's some small possibility that if we have a decent discussion, that you'll tell me something that will eliminate some of my blindness so that I don't have to fall into that particular pit. And if you have a good sensitivity for the depth of the pit, then you know you're pretty bloody motivated to avoid it. Well, that's why hate speech laws are so pernicious. It's like, and that needs to be taken apart. First question, is there such a thing as hate speech? Yes, obviously. People say terrible things, reprehensible things, quasi-criminal things even, all the time. Brutal, and some of them cause a lot of trouble. So the idea that there's hateful speech, it's like, yeah, okay, that's self-evident, no problem. Well, let's regulate it. Okay, fair enough, because it's hateful, you know, maybe we'd rather that there wasn't any of it. Okay, no problem. Who defines hate? Well, we'll worry about that later. It's like, no, you won't. That's actually the problem. Here's the answer to who defines hate. Those people that you would least want to have define it. That will be the inevitable consequence of the legislation, because sensible people won't have anything to do with that. Like people who are power mad will gravitate to that domain to make an ethical case to exercise their controlling power over the language of other people. No, and I've had journalists say, well, what makes you think that your right to free speech trumps the right of someone to not be offended? And I think that's really the level of our political discourse. Okay, so we'll run a little thought experiment. So I'm talking to one person, I'm talking to you, and the rule is I don't get to offend you. Okay, maybe we can still have a discussion about something difficult. But let's say I'm talking to 10 people and about an important thing. Now I have to make sure that I don't say anything, despite the fact that this is an important and contentious issue, that I don't say anything that offends even one of those 10 people. Okay, maybe I can even manage that. What if I'm talking to 1,000 people? There's going to be someone in that 1,000 people, there's going to be someone who's offended at the mere fact that I exist. So it's an impossible standard. It's like, well, you can't say anything offensive. Okay, fine, then you can't say anything. Okay, so what? You don't get to say anything because no one should be offended. Well, then you don't get to think. Well, what happens if you don't think? Well, then you can't negotiate your way through the future and you fall into a pit, and so does everyone else. So that's where that all ends up. You can't say offensive things. Equals, you cannot negotiate your way properly through the future. Equals, everyone suffers. Well, that's a bad strategy. So, and it's all covered up with, well, you know, it'd be better if no one was ever offended. It's like, well, who thinks that? You know how naive you have to be to think that? How you have to be pathologically naive, which is the kind of naive that you could have grown out of, but you willfully refused to because you weren't willing to see what was in front of your face. And then you impose that blind naivety on everyone else because you don't want to allow them to upset your rosy view of yourself and the world. There's no end to how terrible that is. Because it's clearly the case that freedom of speech is not generally in the interests of the power elite, right? Because they already have access to what they need to maintain their grip on the world, let's say, if you look at things in that manner. It's the people at the bottom of the hierarchy whose right to expression needs to be protected.
Yeah. If you're in control of the debate, you don't need freedom of speech.
Oh, right, obviously. So it's always useful for the dispossessed, a freedom of speech issue. Carl Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. It's like, you think about that for about 5 years. I did some of that in 12 Rules for Life. You know, I said, look, what you have to understand is that you're a danger to your children no matter what, right? You can let them go out in the world and be hurt, or you can overprotect them and hurt them that way. So here's your choice. You can make your children competent and courageous, or you can make them safe. But you can't make them safe because life isn't safe. So if you sacrifice their courage and competence on the altar of safety, then you disarm them completely. And all they can do is pray to be protected. Well, that's the Oedipal mother, right? That was Freud's great discovery of the dark mother. And the dark mother is the person, she's the witch in Hansel and Gretel. Gingerbread house, lost children, too good to be true. It's like a house of candy. Wow, who could want anything better? What lives inside the house of candy? The witch that wants to fatten you up and eat you. Right, a cautionary tale about overprotective parents, overprotective mothers, about the overprotective feminine. It's like the psychoanalysts, they were so smart, said the good mother necessarily fails. That's such a brilliant phrase. It's like you can't, as your child matures, you have to fail more and more as a mother, right? Until by the time you're 30, your child's 30, let's say, 25 for that matter, you're not their mother anymore. I mean, obviously you are, but the relationship has hit something like quasi-peer status. Not entirely, obviously, but the child's independent, able to stand up on their own 2 feet and take on the world. It's like, and you know, as a clinician, and Haidt knows this as well, and all the clinicians worth their salt know this, the worst thing you can do for someone who's anxious is overprotect them. It makes them worse. The clinical literature on that is crystal clear. What you do for people who are hyper anxious is gradually expose them with their voluntary consent to increasingly threatening situations. That cures them. It's exactly the opposite of what all the mental health professionals, and I use that term extraordinarily lightly, are trying to do to produce safe spaces on the university campus. Like if a space needs to be defined as safe, you can be sure that's the one thing it is not.
Jordan, this has been fascinating. Let me pay you a compliment. In some ways, I think the most valuable thing you can do for us is to model the courage to speak your mind. You do it forcefully, you do it courageously, you do it compassionately, because the reality is you only have to spend a bit of time with you to realise that you actually care, especially about our young people and what they're experiencing, and especially for our young men, because we know boys model themselves on men who they respect. You're doing a great job of modelling courage in the face of fire.
Well, there's something I'd like to say, maybe in closing, about courage. People say that to me, and I don't think it's exactly right. There's a line in the Old Testament, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I think it's more like that. It's not that I'm courageous, it's that I'm afraid of the right things. So when I made my videos, it wasn't like that didn't make me nervous. But I was less nervous about going back to bed and not saying what I had to say than I was about making the videos, because I know where this is going. I don't want to go there. And so it's not so much courage, it's that it's a matter of, it's less risky to say something than to remain silent when you know there's something to be said. I know that to be the case. And so lots of times in life, it's like, there's no pathway forward that's going to shield you from risk. You get to pick this risk, or you get to pick this risk. And I think I picked the lesser risk. And that might be wise, but I'm not so sure it's courageous.
Well, I think it's admirable. Let's leave it on that basis.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the conversation.